Okay, which is going to say aortic valve, which you cannot see. All right, so we've got valves to the aorta, pulmonary trunk, valves separating the atria from the ventricles. So the atrioventricular valves are the tricuspid and the mitral valve. They have names, tricuspid and mitral valve. Have folds of fibrous tissue that extend into openings between the atrium and the ventricles. They permit blood flow in one direction, from right atrium to right ventricle, from the left atrium to the left ventricle. Again, they're one-way valves. When they close, blood can't be exchanged between the ventricle and the atria. Semilunar valves. The semilunar valves are the valves we talked about being the pulmonary and the aortic valve. Pulmonary and the aortic valve. They prevent backflow of blood into the ventricles. Backflow of blood into the ventricles. Let's take a look at this and start getting an understanding of what's happening. If you were to reach in and just grab a hold of these ventricles and give it a squeeze, what would happen is these valves here would close down because they're one-way valves. The blood being pushed up from you squeezing the ventricles would slam those things shut. But the fluid that's in the chambers here, when you squeeze it, would make it past these, because these are one-way valves too, but it's going with the grain. These would open to the pressure, the pulmonary and the aortic valve. So the AV valves would close when you squeeze. The blood would flow through the pulmonary and the aortic valve. Okay. We have the right atrium receives blood from both the superior vena cava, receives blood from the neck, the head, upper limbs, and chest. The inferior vena cava receives blood from the trunk, the viscera, and lower limbs. Remember, this is deoxygenated blood coming back to the heart so it can be oxygenated again and go out to the rest of the body. Some key terms here. The right atrium contains a foramen ovale. Before birth is an opening through the interatrial septum. It connects the two atrium of the fetal heart and closes at birth, eventually forming the fossa ovalis. So we have the foramen ovale turning into the fossa ovalis at birth. Now, what's going on here? Let's go back. Okay, it looks like we're going to go forward. All right. The fossa ovalis, you can see an outline of it here. Before birth, that's open to where this atrium and this atrium can communicate with one another with its contents. In the adult or after birth, we don't want that to happen because we're trying to separate deoxygenated blood from oxygenated blood. And if we open up those two chambers to each other, we have a problem because we're intermixing the oxygenated blood with the deoxygenated blood, and we've defeated the purpose of the whole system. But here's what's key. Before birth, that process is being handled by the mother, and the child doesn't need that, or the developing child doesn't need that separation. It's being handled by the umbilicus, and so this process is open. Everything is open to itself. Okay, let's see, where were we? And those of you who have had me for classes know that if I get my mind on something else, I'll forget where I was. Happens all the time. Let's see, AV, right atrium. Okay, then we have the pectinate muscles, prominent muscle ridges on the anterior atrial wall and inner surface of the auricle. And we're going to look at these. Let's see. Talking about the tricuspid valve, this is the right atrial ventricular valve, has 3 cusps, prevents backflow of blood, and the tricuspid. Okay. Cusps of the tricuspid valve. There's 1, 2, 3. And the cusp of the mitral, it's not 3 cusps, it's a bicuspid valve. Free edges of valves attached to the chordae tendineae, or tendineae, however you want to pronounce it, from the papillary muscles of the ventricle. Prevent valve from opening backwards. And what we're looking at here is we've got the cusps, and attached to the cusps are these strands called the chordae tendineae, and they attach to muscles called the papillary muscles. So we have the chordae tendineae attaching to the papillary muscles. When the ventricles contract, we want those to contract too, even though they're going to push these valves closed. We don't want them to go through. So they've got to be held in place, even though that pressure is hitting them. We don't want it to be like an umbrella that's in the wind and it just goes backwards on itself because there's too much wind pressure, which grabs it. So we've got the muscles hanging on to it with these tendons, chordae tendineae, holding those cusps. Even though they close, we don't want them to go the opposite direction. Better look at it here. We've got the papillary muscles, which contract. They're holding the chordae tendineae, which is attached to the cusps. Another look at the heart. Things are sectioned out a little bit so we can see inside. If I were to ask you, is this the right or left ventricle, just based on the thickness of it, you should be able to tell me that this is the left ventricle. It pumps blood out the aorta to the whole system. Whereas this is the right ventricle. It only has to pump the blood, as we go through here, to the lungs. And we can see some things, landmarks that we've looked at already. The trabeculae carnae, which is the muscle folds inside the ventricles. The cusps of the papillary muscles holding the ligaments of the cusps. Auricle covering the right atrium. Ascending aorta, superior vena cava, brachiocephalic trunk, left common carotid artery, left subclavian artery, tricuspid valve. Remember the tricuspid valve, 3 valves in the right ventricle. Even though this is a bicuspid valve, they call it in the left ventricle the mitral valve. And we have the pulmonary valves and the aortic valve. Let's see, yes. The conus arteriosus at the superior end of the right ventricle ends at the pulmonary valve. 3 semilunar cusps, leads to the pulmonary trunk. Let's see, start of the pulmonary circuit divides into left and right pulmonary arteries. Okay, conus arteriosus. It's this area right here before we get to the valve in the pulmonary trunk. The conus arteriosus. Okay. The left atrium receives blood from left and right pulmonary veins. Blood passes to the left ventricle through mitral valve, left atrioventricular valve, and bicuspid valve, or bicuspid valve, two cusps, left atrium. Okay, so here's the left atrium. Oh, I'm sorry, the left atrium's here. Let's get a better idea of the blood flow. Let's start getting a handle on this. Deoxygenated blood from the lower body is coming up through the inferior vena cava. Deoxygenated blood from the upper portion of the body is coming through the superior vena cava, and it's coming into the right atrium. Remember, this is deoxygenated blood. It's done its job. It needs to get oxygenated again to be able to be pushed out into the body to provide the body with more oxygen in the tissues. Deoxygenated blood. Now that deoxygenated blood, which is in the atrium, will pass through down into the right ventricle. That right ventricle will squeeze and it will push these cusps close so it doesn't go back up into the atrium. So when the ventricle closes or is squeezed, those cusps close and the blood is pushed through the valves, semilunar valves here, up through the pulmonary trunk, both left and right pulmonary arteries. Now, even though we're calling those arteries in the pulmonary portion here, it's still deoxygenated blood. So we're coming through the pulmonary arteries to the lungs. We're going into the lungs, deep into the area where gas exchange takes place, which is the alveoli of the lungs. We're becoming reoxygenated blood. That reoxygenated blood comes back to the heart through the pulmonary, left and right pulmonary veins. So it's coming back in. So we go out to the lungs, get oxygenated, come back in through the pulmonary veins to the left atrium, where we're oxygenated blood now. This oxygenated blood will drop down into, when those valves open, will drop down into the left ventricle here. And when that left ventricle contracts, well, it's both the right and the left, but when that contracts, that will drive blood out, close these cusps off, and then the blood will go through this section here where hidden are the semilunar valves for the aortic arch. So this blood will come out through here, close the cusps, and it'll go through to the body, the rest of the body, upper, and then descend to the descending aorta to the rest of the system. Okay, so let's get a better idea of what's going on there. So it talks about the left atrium. Receives blood from the left and right pulmonary veins. Blood passes to the left ventricle through the mitral valve. The left ventricle, similar to the right ventricle, but does not have moderator bands. Blood leaves the left ventricle through the aortic valve into the ascending aorta. Blood leaves the left ventricle through the aortic valve into the ascending aorta. Blood leaves the left ventricle through the semilunar valves to the aorta, left ventricle. Aortic sinuses, sac-like expansions at the base of the ascending aorta. Ascending aorta turns to become aortic arch, which becomes the descending aorta. Ascending, arch, descending. Ascending aorta, arch, descending aorta. Back behind it. Okay. Compared to the left ventricle, the right ventricle holds and pumps the same amount of blood. It just doesn't have to go as far. It has thinner walls, develops less pressure, is more pouch-shaped than round. Okay, so in dissection, you'll notice that the ventricle, if we were to do a transverse section, which in fact we won't, you would see that it's more round or more pouch-shaped than round. And here we see a picture of that. This is the left ventricle. You can see how thick it is. It needs to squeeze the blood deep into the tissues of the whole system, the whole body, whereas the right ventricle is thinner walled. It doesn't have to. This area right here would be the, you name it quickly, okay, interventricular septum. Interventricular septum. Okay, here we see a sulcus. Posterior sulcus behind. Another picture of the transverse view, looking down at it. Non-contracted, contracted. Heart valves, they prevent backflow of blood. Again, we discussed those being one way. The atrioventricular valves are between the atria and the ventricles. When the ventricles contract, the blood pressure closes the valves. Papillary muscles contract, and as I mentioned, the tense chordae tendineae, which are attached to the papillary muscles, hold those valves in place so they don't flip backwards. Prevents regurgitation or backflow of blood into the atrium. We don't want that either, do we? No. Semilunar valves, pulmonary and the aortics, prevent backflow of blood into the ventricles. No muscular braces. Valvular heart disease, VHD, deterioration of the valve function may develop after carditis, inflammation of the heart, may result in rheumatic fever, inflammatory autoimmune response to streptococcal bacteria. Here is a picture of the skeleton, the cardiac skeleton that we were talking about, which is right here. We can see that that skeleton involves the valves, makes up the valves, and it's one structure that's held in place here. That would be a transverse section, superior view of the atrium, the vessels removed, the cardiac skeleton. We're seeing the left ventricle here, the right ventricle here. We're looking down inside the ventricles. We see the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve are closed, while the mitral valve and the tricuspid valve are open. Now, if you see that, what direction is the blood flowing? Well, the blood must be draining from the atria down into the ventricles. From the atria down into the ventricles. Okay, getting ready for those ventricles to squeeze. And when they squeeze, these valves will close as it's coming up. The blood is coming up, and it will open these valves here. So gravity will, whatever's above the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve, gravity will force those one-way valves closed as it tries to drop down on them. While they're closed, these chambers are filling, we squeeze it, these open up, the pressure opens up those valves. I'll go through that again here. As the atrium is filling blood into the ventricles. The mitral valve is open. Blood comes in here. It's coming from the pulmonary veins, having just been oxygenated by the lungs. It's coming from the pulmonary veins and dropping into the ventricle here. These valves, the aortic valve is closed. When this ventricle squeezes, it closes this one-way valve here, the mitral valve, but opens these because it's going the opposite direction. So the blood can get out to the system. But we don't want to force it back into the lungs. We just came from there. Okay. Same thing. We're just showing you, let's see, it's just here the ventricles have contracted, the blood or these valves have closed, and we can see how there's a tricuspid valve here. The tricuspid valve is closed, the mitral valve is closed. It's a bicuspid, two-cusp, but we call it the mitral valve versus tricuspid valve. Again, the skeleton, these are closed, ventricles contracted, blood's coming through, opening up the aortic valve and the pulmonary valve. Another view, basically showing you the same thing. Ventricle contracts, pushes these close. The papillary muscles contract, hanging on tight to that chordae tendineae as well as those cusps so they don't flip backwards the opposite direction. Blood flows out the valve here, the aortic valve. Coronary circulation supplies blood to the muscle tissue of the heart. We've touched on that a little bit. The coronary arteries originate at aortic sinuses. Elevated blood pressure and elastic rebound of the aorta maintains blood flow through the coronary arteries. The right coronary artery supplies blood to the right atrium, portions of both ventricles, portions of the electrical conducting system of the heart. The right coronary artery gives rise to, as it branches out, marginal arteries and the posterior interventricular artery. The left coronary artery supplies blood to the left ventricle, the left atrium, the interventricular septum. It gives rise, the left coronary artery gives rise, branches to the circumflex artery and the anterior interventricular artery. There's an arterial anastomosis. It's an interconnection anterior and posterior interventricular arteries. Maintains constant blood supply to the cardiac muscle. Okay, there's a lot of the stuff we're looking for. Okay, cardiac veins. We have the great cardiac vein. Drains blood from region supplied by the anterior interventricular artery. Returns blood to the coronary sinus, which opens into the right atrium. We discussed that a little bit already. Posterior vein of the left ventricle, the middle cardiac vein, and the small cardiac vein empty into the great cardiac vein or the coronary sinus. Anterior cardiac veins empty into the right atrium. Let's take a look at some of the stuff that's going on here. Little identification. What was this thing called here? The auricle. Yes. Now, is it the right or the left auricle? It's the right auricle. Identification now of some of these coronary arteries and veins. The right coronary artery is large, up top. The left coronary artery, right and left coronary arteries. Okay, on the left coronary artery, it gives rise to a branch, the circumflex artery, and this branch, the anterior interventricular artery. Anterior interventricular artery. Circumflex artery branch and the anterior interventricular artery. The right coronary artery, as we're coming down through here, is giving rise to atrial arteries. Let's see, we've got the marginal artery down along the ventricle here. Down along the ventricle here. Look at the posterior side of the heart and the arteries. We have that circumflex artery, which was right here. Okay. And that was a branch of the left coronary artery. We gave rise to the circumflex artery, which is wrapping around to the posterior side here, giving rise to the marginal artery. The vein, as we're wrapping around here, let's go back. We have the circumflex artery. The great cardiac vein is right here. That great cardiac vein, the blood is flowing this way. And we're going to come into the coronary sinus, which drains into the right atrium. So we have blood, deoxygenated blood, coming from above into the superior vena cava, coming from below into the inferior vena cava, and coming from the heart itself, because this is the heart's blood supply, deoxygenated blood coming to the coronary sinus, which dumps into the right atrium. Okay, middle cardiac vein we can see here. Posterior vein of the left ventricle here. Same thing we've discussed. We can just see a little better here on the coronary sinus, posterior interventricular artery, great cardiac vein here, inferior vena cava, superior vena cava, left pulmonary veins, right pulmonary veins. Now, is it oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood that's coming through the pulmonary veins? It's oxygenated blood, which is coming from the lungs. It's oxygenated blood. Versus the pulmonary arteries, right and left pulmonary arteries, is that oxygenated blood or deoxygenated blood? It's deoxygenated blood. It's going to the lungs to get oxygen so it can come back to the heart.